I apologize for the lateness of the story. It's long. That being said, Princess Celestia, the Changeling Queen, by Ren 55. Chapter 18. Trust and Traitors. In the end, you have to choose whether or not to trust someone. Sophie Kinsella, Shopaholic and Baby. Hallway. As reluctant as Chrysalis was to admit, the massage session had been quite relaxing. Although her carapace made it a bit difficult for the ponies to treat her, the oils had felt so soothing on her chitin. The long day of debates, arguments, and discussions were rubbed away by trained hooves. Of course, the masseuse's strong, possibly bone-breaking hooves were watched warily by the 6 guards that accompanied her right now. Each of them were chevaliers of her black guard, dressed in their heavy armor, and, with their poleaxes, they made for an imposing and beautiful sight. As the entourage made their way down a vaulted corridor, adorned with stained glass windows to the right side. "I'm going to check on my daughter," said Chrysalis in warning to her guards. The chevaliers nodded as Chrysalis closed her eyes and focused on the connection between herself and Lamia. "Lamia, how was your dueling practice?" inquired Chrysalis through her mental link. Lamia's thoughts flowed back to Chrysalis, somewhat slowly. It seemed as if her daughter was quite tired. "It's more like a grueling lesson than a practice. I can't talk to you right now, Mom. I'm fighting with Princess Celestia." Chrysalis's concentration was shattered at her daughter's statement, and her eyes grew to the size of plates. Princess Celestia? Was what? Why was the Alicorn fighting Lamia? Then Chrysalis froze. "Lamia, get away from her immediately! She's going to pulverize you!" roared Chrysalis. It was this moment when Chrysalis's entourage began to round a corner in the hallway. The scenario Chrysalis had dreaded since the start of the conference decided to spring itself onto the Changeling Queen. The 2 chevaliers who had just passed the corner were taken on a trip through the glass windows by beams of magic of various colors. Without pause, Chrysalis's remaining chevaliers sprang into action, forming a protective foursquare around their queen. Chrysalis herself, after a momentary gasp, had lit her horn, prepared to confront her ambushers. To Chrysalis's horror, more than a dozen earth ponies, pegasi, and unicorns charged around the corner of the hall. They wielded a variety of weapons, ranging from wicked-looking battle axes and warhammers to deadly spears and javelins. "Fool's gold!" screamed Chrysalis into her hive link, just as a javelin sped toward her. The moment her mother had screamed into the hive link, Lamia had been disarmed by Celestia once more. Panting heavily, Lamia had just telekinetically retrieved her rapier when she heard the damning words. "No!" gasped Lamia. She herself had decided on the signal of Fool's Gold, for if the worst-case scenario had emerged at the conference, but she had never expected it to be used. For those words, once spoken, meant that the ponies had just launched an ambush, and every changeling was to immediately assemble and fight their way to safety. Dimly, the changeling heard Celestia asking what was wrong as Lamia submerged herself into her hive link, while her tired muscles tensed to react to Celestia. "Mother! Mother!" yelled Lamia into the connection to her mother. But there was no answer. Fear turning her blood cold, Lamia glanced up to see Celestia approaching her, weapon holstered. The Alicorn seemed to have a concerned expression, but Lamia stepped back. her mind working furiously. Lamia considered Celestia's odd appearance, her friendliness, and the dueling lesson she had taught. Had it all been a ploy to keep her from her mother? Lamia, is something... Celestia stopped as Lamia's 4 guards formed a protective wall in front of their charge. Gratefully, Lamia thanked herself that she had allowed her mother to assign her a greater guard detail. She was too tired to... The queen's eye widened. "That was your plan all along?" demanded Lamia. "What?" asked Celestia. She appeared genuinely bemused, but Lamia's only eye narrowed in suspicion. "You planned to separate me from my mother, tire me out with your little dueling lesson so that you can assassinate the leadership of our hive?" said Lamia with a growl. Yet, to her surprise, Celestia blinked, threw her rapier away, folded her wings, and lowered her head. It was almost as if she was submitting to Lamia, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Lamia, please, if your mother is in danger, tell me where she is so I can help her," begged Celestia. "You know where she is! Your guards must be fighting her at this very moment!" retorted Lamia. "Lamia, believe me, I don't know anything about the assassination," insisted Celestia desperately. "You have your little maid, Cinderhooves, over here. I know she's not just any normal maid. I was a fool to think so. She's been trained by a fencing master. Besides, why would an alicorn need guards to overpower a crippled changeling queen?" said Lamia, sneering. Celestia's features twisted in anguish and frustration. It was something which Lamia thought was out of place for a supposedly backstabbing alicorn. Celestia should be happier, eager to see her assassination plan come to fruition. Not fearful. It almost looked as if she was horrified. "I admit Cinderhooves is not a normal maid, but please, Lamia, why would I try killing either you or your mother now of all times? Especially since we've managed to achieve so much in the peace talks. Did we not just finish an agreement for a cultural exchange between changelings and ponies? Why would I ever bother hammering out the specifics of the agreement if I was going to kill you today?" asked Celestia. Her voice was strained but calm. Every word was carefully enunciated. Lamia frowned. Celestia had a point. The agreement had been particularly beneficial to changelings and equestrians. But Chrysalis was under attack, and it had to be by ponies. And since her mother had been so much more open to the treaty-making process, she must have been certain to use that last resort. Celestia had to be lying. There's no way the princess had no knowledge of this. "Princess Celestia, I want to trust you, but I can't. It can't be a coincidence that you approached me with a weapon just after I separated from my mother. Neither can it be so convenient that the attack falls now when I am not by my mother's side," said Lamia coldly. The changeling raised her weapon, horn glowing, her eyes hard as ice. "Now I'm warning you, Princess Celestia. Stand aside!" In the last moment, Chrysalis managed to seize the javelin with her telekinesis. However, as she brought it to a guard position, her remaining changeling guards were immediately engaged by the attackers, leaving Chrysalis alone. Her horn glowing, the queen used her stolen javelin to deflect a sword thrust by one of the unicorn guard's ponies. Stepping back, Chrysalis focused her magic into a concentrated beam that forced several of the guards to dodge. However, before the changeling was able to press her advantage, 2 Bekasai guards with spears and an earth pony wielding a nasty warhammer approached from her 3 sides. Her javelin's point scything through the air, Chrysalis stabbed at the right wing of the Pegasus to her right, followed up with a magic blast that smacked into the guard's chest plate, knocking him out of the air. Spinning around, Chrysalis slammed the weapon into the other Pegasus's side. The blow knocked the pony out of the sky. Horn flashing brightly, Chrysalis cast a massive fireball at the Earth Pony and the sword-wielding unicorn that had attacked her earlier. The unicorn managed to partially block Chrysalis's magic, but the Earth Pony was engulfed in flames and screamed in agony as the spell torched his fur and hair. Chrysalis ignored the assassin's cry and faced the unicorn, growling menacingly as he was joined by a Pegasus and another Earth Pony. In one lightning-fast motion, Chrysalis tensed and looked as if she was about to spring towards the Earth Pony. However, before her hooves left the ground, Chrysalis used her wings to spin herself around and charge at the unicorn. The feint took the guards by surprise, and Chrysalis was able to get close enough to the unicorn to slam her two front hooves into his face with a delightful crunch. Before the other two ponies could react, Chrysalis once again channeled her magic. From her horn lanced out two green spears of energy that slammed into the guards, chucking them across. As she was completing the spell, though, a sharp, blunt pain exploded in her side. A cry of anger and frustration tore itself from Chrysalis's mouth as she slammed the mallet-wielding Earth Pony, who had managed to sneak up on her with a sharp kick. However, Chrysalis kicked too hard and overextended herself. When she finally regained her balance and focused herself, she saw two Pegasi lunging forward, battle axe and warhammer arching down in an overhoof swing. Chrysalis tried to step back, but to her dismay, her rear end hit the wall. Adrenaline pounding through her veins, Chrysalis blocked the two weapons with her stolen javelin, reinforcing her own weapon with her magic. Roaring to channel her might, Chrysalis surged forward, forcing her assailants back. Her muscles flexing, Chrysalis's forehooves bucked the two Pegasi out of the sky. To ensure they stayed on the ground, Chrysalis stamped on the Pegasi's wings. However, there was no time for Chrysalis to rest. As she turned her attention back to the battle, the queen found herself faced once more by her opponents. Chrysalis gritted her teeth and snarled threateningly at the new arrivals. In her heart, though, she worried about the safety of her daughter.
Lady Lamia, please, the princess has nothing to do with whatever is happening to your mother. Please, let us help you, begged Cinderhooves.
Lamia barely even glanced at the Pegasus's tearful pleas as her squad of guards slowly began to edge out of the dueling hall.
I admit you have been a very helpful servant, Cinderhooves, but I've only known you for a few days. I cannot trust you, said Lamia dismissively.
As Lamia and her guards began to slowly inch toward the entrance, Cinderhooves hesitated for a moment. Her eyes screwed shut before she opened her mouth and screamed.
Then, trust your sister!
As if a bucket of freezing water had just been poured over her head, Lamia spun around, glaring at the Pegasus, her eyes filled with fury.
Sister? You dare name yourself after my sister?
Roared Lamia. Just what was this foolish pony trying to do by invoking sisterhood with her? Instead of fear, the Pegasus met Lamia's accusing glare with one filled with determination. To Lamia's shock, a green fire rose in a circle around the Pegasus. Flesh gave way to dark chitin, feathers to transparent wings. A horn grew from the pony's head, while her eyes glazed over, replaced by hard lenses.
Syndra? Whispered Lamia, barely able to understand who she saw in front of her. She glanced at Celestia to judge the Alicorn's reaction, but the princess seemed oddly calm at the new revelation. Lamia blinked. Celestia, you knew my sister was Cinderhooves? Demanded Lamia. The younger changeling grimaced. Yes, she did. Lamia felt a sinking feeling in her heart, and horror filled her eyes as she stared at her younger sister. In the negotiations, her mother had remarked that Celestia had been too accepting of the changeling demands, too knowledgeable on how they infiltrated. Lamia had assumed that Chrysalis was being paranoid, but not anymore. You were the ones helping the ponies? It was like Lamia's words had impaled Syndra through the heart, and the younger changeling faltered for a moment. But instead of falling, Syndra trotted forward to Lamia, and her guards drew her rapier. Lamia tensed. Her guards raised their weapons in readiness. Yet Syndra slowly wrapped her rapier with her magic and raised to head level. Slowly the rapier's tip spun around like a compass until it was pointing at herself. To Lamia's eyes' shock, Miss Syndra floated the weapon closer to herself until it was a hair's breadth away from her rapidly moistening eyes. Yes, I betrayed our hive again. But please, Lamia, I was trying to stop a war between the ponies and changelings. I didn't know you were hurt. I didn't know you were starving. I helped Celestia because there was no one else who could have helped. Syndra paused as she tried not to hiccup. And Celestia did help. She informed me of the hive situation, and after I told her that Mother would never act this way without good reason, she personally went to your hive. She also had many opportunities to kill me, torture me, or use me as a hostage, but she hasn't. I know it's difficult for you to trust the word of a worthless traitor, but you have to believe me that I love our mother. If you really want proof that I'm telling the truth, just give the order and I'll kill myself. In one sudden motion, Lamia barreled through her guards and knocked the weapon out of her younger sister's magical grasp. Damn it, Syndra! Don't you dare scare me like that again! Sobbed Lamia as she embraced Syndra, crushing the smaller changeling against her body with her single leg. Syndra leant into Lamia, tears of relief rushing down her eyes, which quickly intermingled with Lamia's own. The two sisters held each other for a long moment. Then Lamia raised her head to examine Celestia, who seemed to be wearing a slight smile. Lamia was wary of what her sister had told Celestia. In fact, although she was overjoyed that her sister was safe, she couldn't help but feel outraged. Her sister had not only endangered her hive, she had cost them a massive diplomatic trump card. Yet, Lamia was most hurt by the fact that her own sister had decided to side against her. However, Lamia also knew Syndra would never willingly endanger the hive. She accepted her exile willingly, and Lamia remembered how close Syndra had been to killing herself for mistakenly leading the dragonflight to their hive. Not only that, the information Lamia had gleaned from Syndra's short outburst seemed to indicate that Syndra had been in her own way trying to protect the hive.
Moreover, Lamia was aware that the longer she hesitated, the worse position their mother would be in. Like it or not, she needed all the help she could get, and the princess had so far shown herself to be a reliable ally. After all, she was still alive right now. Celestia had really wanted to kill her and her mother, or even use her as a hostage. Why take so long to do it? Why reveal her sister? Why go through all this trauma? As Syndra cried into her shoulder, Lamia turned to the princess.
Last time I heard, she was making her way to her quarters from the spa,
said Lamia cautiously. Thank you. Now plug your ears, ordered Celestia. Before the changelings could react, Celestia let loose her rumored royal Canterlot voice. Royal guards, to the 7th corridor now! As the changelings staggered from the bellow, Celestia turned toward them. Brace yourselves, I'm teleporting, warned Celestia, her horn glowing. There was a mighty zap, and Lamia watched the dueling room and her guards vanish, to be replaced by a corridor with one side lined with stained glass windows. This is the only corridor from the guest quarters to the spa rooms. They have to be along here somewhere, said Celestia, her eyes searching for any sight or conflict of battle. It was then they heard the clash of steel on steel and the cries of changelings and ponies locked in a battle. Celestia moved like the wind, her wings extended as she charged down the hall. Not far behind her, Lamia and Syndra, practiced rapiers in their grasp, raced behind the Alicorn princess. All of them hoped they would get there in time. The air thrummed with energy as Chrysalis pointed her horn at one of her assailants and released the magic she had built up. With an almighty crack, forks of green lightning sparked through the air and electrified several of the assailants. As soon as those stallions dropped limply to the ground, their armor smoking, Chrysalis immediately turned to engage another pair of assassins armed with deadly poleaxes. Nimbly, Chrysalis dodged the Earth Pony's wild swings, countering when possible with her own javelin or spells. So engrossed she was in the deadly weave of blades that she didn't notice the battle cries from down the corridor. But there was no way Chrysalis could miss her daughter Lamia, as well as another female changeling, stabbed their rapiers into the sides of the ponies fighting her. While the blunted, practiced rapiers didn't penetrate deeply into the two assassins, the ponies had cried out in pain and retreated, hurriedly limping away. Neither could Chrysalis ignore the golden lance of magic that cut through the middle of the fight, taking out 3 of the ambushing guards' ponies. The changeling looked to find the source of the magic. She blinked. It was Princess Celestia, her tricolor mane rippling like a raging river, and her horn bright as the sun itself. Gods! Are you attacking the ambassadors of a foreign nation in violation of all international laws? Lay down your weapons and surrender now, said Celestia in a voice as cold as it was terrifying. The guards didn't reply. Instead, they ran as fast as they could. However, Celestia sealed off the corridor with a towering wall of flame, preventing the guards from leaving. Eyes wide, Chrysalis watched the enraged Alicorn advance on the guards' ponies, and noticed to her shock that the tiles were cracking under her hooves. Then Chrysalis felt the alicorn's anger fizzle out, replaced with bafflement. "You are not royal guards," stated Celestia.
"What?"
exclaimed Lamia, bloodied rapier upraised. Chrysalis had the same question on her mind, but Celestia voiced the answer before she could say anything. "That's not armor my royal guards use now. My guards were never equipped with battle axes or war hammers," said Celestia, her tone growing more frigid by the second. Chrysalis blinked as the alicorn's fury rose again, but it was accompanied with intense suspicion. "Who are you? Who sent you? Answer me or face the consequences," warned Celestia. The guards' ponies glanced at each other before running to the broken windows, but Celestia sealed the windows with another flame spell. The false guards froze, unable to escape as Celestia's horn began to shimmer, magical tendrils weaving through the air. One by one, the assassins keeled over, falling into an enchanted sleep. Her features grim, Celestia roared through the hallway, forcing all to clamp their hooves over their ears. "Lock down the base, Captain Armor! The 5th Guard Squad and medical personnel to the West Corridor, now!" Within moments, the corridor was swarming with royal guards. Changelings and medical personnel, both pony and changeling, at first. This crowd only needed and added to the chaos of the moment. That was until Chrysalis reigned in her changelings, and Celestia ordered Shining Armor and her guard not to approach the changelings unless asked for. The palpable tension was in the air as changeling medics tended to their wounded, while Royal Guards ponies handcuffed and marched away the assassins. Chrysalis had initially allowed herself to be administered by a horde of changeling medics and chevaliers, who formed a protective cordon around her. But after a long while of having her subjects fuss and worry over her, the changeling queen gently broke through the protective wall and faced Celestia. The queen's eyes were producing a murderous glare that rattled the bones of every pony in the hallway. "Celestia, you better have a damn good explanation for what just happened," roared Chrysalis. Despite the hostile audacity and acidity that oozed from Chrysalis's tone, Celestia's reply was calm. "Queen Chrysalis, and don't even try to dodge the question with all your niceties. 6 members of my bodyguard detail are in critical condition because of your ponies, and I demand to know why," roared Chrysalis. "Which is why I'm offering you the chance to help me interrogate these ponies. As long as you do not harm the prisoners, you are free to ask them any questions and participate in the interrogation procedure in the future. When we discipline them, I promise you, you will have a say in how they are punished. Do you wish to accept?" asked Celestia. Chrysalis blinked and stared at the pony princess. She had not been expecting that offer, against everything she had expected Celestia to do. She thought Celestia would want to protect her ponies from her, not let her interrogate them. "Why are you asking me to help you?" "Believe me, Queen Chrysalis, when I want to find out what happened as much as you do," said Celestia. Despite her suspicion, Chrysalis could hear the steel in Celestia's voice and the sincerity that it held.
So you had no hoof in this? Asked Chrysalis warily. Chrysalis, I won't even try to guess how furious you are at what just happened. But please think. What would I gain from killing you now?
Celestia raised her hoof, almost taking a step forward, but she stopped as Chrysalis stepped back.
Didn't we just finish the details on a cultural exchange between ponies and changelings? One of the first steps to healing the rift between our two species? And I've told you before, war with the changelings would harm Equestria as well as the changelings. Why would I risk a war by trying to kill you when we've come so far on the road to peace? Asked Celestia. Wouldn't the death of a possible threat to Equestria be a satisfactory result? Replied Chrysalis, still not fully convinced by Celestia's plea. Then why didn't I try to hold your daughters hostage? You and Lamia were separated. It was the perfect opportunity for me to kill or capture her, said Celestia.
Chrysalis frowned and slowly went over Celestia's arguments and what she knew of the alicorn. The points raised by Celestia were rather hard to refute. Why would Celestia endanger herself and place so much effort in this peace conference if her only goal was to kill Chrysalis? Why would Celestia save her supposed enemy? Chrysalis bit her lip. Perhaps it could have been some elaborate ploy to gain her trust. Chrysalis focused on Celestia, using her abilities to read the alicorn's emotions. To the changeling's interest, Celestia was horrified, and not at Chrysalis. Even as Chrysalis skimmed the surface of Celestia's emotions, her hypothesis of Celestia using some elaborate ploy to gain her trust was quickly disproved. Instead of disappointment that Chrysalis hadn't died, Celestia was feeling concern. She was angry, but her anger was directed at the situation, at the assassins. Her tensed muscles slowly relaxing, Chrysalis began to ponder Celestia's offer. It wasn't perfect. She wanted to make the assassins pay on her own terms. But considering she anticipated Celestia to completely shut her out from the investigation in order to protect her subjects, this was a really good offer that Chrysalis could not pass up. All right, Celestia. I accept your offer, and I swear not to harm any of the prisoners. I will be taking my escort, though. Lamia, I want you to... Chrysalis paused. Lamia seemed oddly nervous, even though the fighting was over. Even more curious was the changeling hiding behind Lamia. Chrysalis arched an eyebrow. Is there something you would like to tell me about the changeling hiding behind you, Lamia? Lamia swallowed. Yes, Mother, but she's no ordinary changeling. As Chrysalis frowned at the puzzling statement, Lamia reluctantly stepped sideways. Chrysalis was confused for a split second, until she recognized the revealed changeling as the one who had jumped in to stab one of her assassins. In a brief moment, Chrysalis took in the short, lithe stature and identified her as a scout. As Chrysalis met the changeling's eyes, though, she found herself paralyzed with shock. For the changeling's eyes that were not the hard lenses of most other changelings, but were actual eyes, green as Chrysalis's own. And there were only 2 changelings that had those eyes. "Syndra," whispered Chrysalis.
"Hello, Mother?"
croaked Syndra. Chrysalis took a step forward, but her hooves were strangely heavy and she staggered. Syndra and Lamia started forward to support her, but Chrysalis had other plans. Throwing her hooves around the shoulder of her daughters, Chrysalis drew them into an embrace. Syndra squeaked, but fell silent as her mother burst into tears.
"Syndra, you're alive! I was so worried about you. If you had known the truth,
But it had torn Chrysalis's heart to sever her daughter from the hive and banish her. Either that or Chrysalis would have been forced to kill her own flesh and blood. It was something the queen knew she could never have done to her youngest daughter. For Chrysalis loved Syndra. Strangely enough, Syndra squirmed in Chrysalis's arms, as if she was trying to break free from the hug.
"Mother, I'm sorry. I've betrayed you,"
sobbed Syndra. Chrysalis frowned.
"You don't understand. I forgave you for breaking that law a long time ago, and you have already paid the price in banishment." "No, you don't understand. I told Celestia about our hive's infiltration strategies,"
wailed Syndra. There was a silence. Lamia bit her lip, waiting for her mother's reaction. Chrysalis stared down at the tear-filled eyes of her daughter. She snarled and glared at Celestia.
"Celestia, what did you threaten my daughter with?"
growled Chrysalis. The princess appeared to sigh before turning to face Chrysalis.
"The threat of you foolishly launching an all-out war on Equestria was enough incentive for your daughter to inform me the details of your hive's infiltration strategy,"
said Celestia. The reply caught Chrysalis off guard.
"What?"
demanded the changeling.
"Your daughter was captured after Canterlot. Her disguise was stripped by the shield spell Cadence and Shining Armor were forced to use. She bravely realized that if your hive continued to fight Equestria, it would only lead to the destruction and annihilation of the changeling race. At the time, we had no way of knowing that Lamia had been attacked by ponies. I asked her for your infiltration procedures so I could counter and subdue any subversive elements within Equestria's ranks. This would allow for me to quickly end any war and as bloodlessly as possible in order to stop you. The whole reason that changelings have become known as a hostile race," said Celestia.
Chrysalis stared at Syndra, furious at Celestia's scheme and horrified that her daughter had willingly betrayed such an important hive secret. Yet that fury rapidly faded as Chrysalis saw the cold logic to what Celestia had said. The actions the Alicorn had taken in the aftermath of a hostile force attacking them were not too different from what Chrysalis would have done. She didn't let go of Syndra, but her grasp did tighten.
"You manipulated my daughter into betraying me,"
retorted Chrysalis, turning once more onto Celestia. Celestia sighed in resignation.
"I did persuade her. I needed the information. But I cannot hide from you that I did give your daughter the opportunity to make a choice."
Chrysalis glared at Syndra for a long moment, noticing her daughter's trembling form. Her anger at Syndra's actions wanted to make her throw her child away from her. However, guilt stayed her hoof. Syndra, I have heard that from Celestia about why you told her about our hive's infiltration strategies. What is your explanation? Syndra cringed and inverted her gaze, unable to meet her mother's rapidly hardening eyes.
I was scared for our hive, and for you. With the attack on Canterlot, you would seem to have gone mad. I saw your actions only made it harder for our infiltrators to gather love. I've also lived with ponies for 5 years. I have seen their military power, and when their anger is provoked, their strength and unity. And admittedly, I didn't see why they deserved to be attacked. Maybe we could have won the war, but the cost would have been far too high. Thus, I wanted to do anything I could to save you and your hive from the anger and rage that the ponies would bring. If giving the information would end a possible war earlier, by perhaps forcing you to surrender due to your infiltrators being discovered, then I was willing to give it.
Chrysalis's eyes narrowed, her rage subsiding, only to be replaced by thinly suppressed fury and disappointment. As if sensing her rage, Celestia trotted forward to face the Changeling Queen. You have to understand, Chrysalis. From your daughter, I was able to discern more about your current state of mind. She told about your foresight, loyalty, and love for your hive. But also about your shrewd nature. Thanks to her information, I was able to understand that perhaps you are not as mad as I thought you were. Her testimony and the evidence I found of your changeling starving were crucial to convincing me that you may have had legitimate reasons for attacking Canterlot. Without that, I would have never approached you personally, and we'd be at war. As Celestia finished, Chrysalis stayed silent, trying to consider the choices in her mind. Though the Queen's features were locked into a silent glare, Chrysalis's heart was torn. Celestia's actions were understandable, and though they frustrated Chrysalis, they were not currently on the Queen's mind. It was Syndra's portrayal that Chrysalis could not ignore, and the dilemma it posed. After all, Chrysalis could see why Syndra chose to help Celestia. How would Syndra have known that her own sister had been hurt by ponies if she had no contact with her own hive? How could an exile realize the motivations that led to her sovereign to embark on such a seemingly foolhardy move? Chrysalis grimaced. She had to admit, attacking Canterlot was not her brightest plan ever. But Chrysalis's fury could not be extinguished by simple rationalizations. Yet, she understood why Syndra had done so. But she couldn't understand why her own daughter had betrayed her. How could her own flesh and blood do this to her own family? What had she done to make the changeling she loved and raised, rewarded and punished, turn on her like that? Were her actions so unreasonable they could not be seen in any other light? The queen glared at her daughter, her grip too tight, a snarl on her unforgiving features. As she watched her mother's visage darken like a coming storm, Syndra's eyes widened. Her worst nightmare was unfolding right before her like a monster crawling out from under the bed. Syndra! How dare you betray our hive, betray me after I granted you mercy? Chrysalis's voice was quivering from repressed anger, and her frame was locked in the vice of her control. One slip of control, and Chrysalis wasn't sure what she would have done as vengeful thoughts ran through her head. But the changeling held back. Out of some last love or restraint, she wasn't sure. Syndra's eyes watered yet again. Chrysalis shoved her daughter away from her. She couldn't afford to do anything else, lest she lash out with anger. Yet that slight action seemed to break Syndra, as she began to cry softly. Her daughter's tears almost made Chrysalis regret her decision. At least, almost. Leave now, and do not show your face to me again until I call on you, said Chrysalis, a hint of a growl in her voice as she turned away from her youngest daughter. Yet her attempt to ignore the sobs of despair from her child only led her to find Lamia blocking her path. A horrified expression on her face. Mother, I beg you to reconsider. Lamia, I will consider the fact that Syndra helped thwart my near assassination, but she has yet again broken another of our key rules of our species and endangered our hive. And this time she did so willingly. Knowing the consequences, I cannot overlook this, said Chrysalis harshly, just allowing a hint of the fury she felt slip out. Without another word, Chrysalis strode past her frozen daughter. Her eyes narrowed, hoof steps clicking decisively against the stone floor. Celestia walked right up to Celestia and thrust her hoof into the alicorn's face. And you, Princess Celestia, I accept the rationale behind your actions, but let me make this clear. I do not like what you did, and if you have such a good reason for doing so, I would rip your throat out, snarled Chrysalis. Celestia only dipped her head in assent, not even flinching at the queen's threat. I understand, Queen Chrysalis. With that, the changelings marched away. Chrysalis kept her eyes forward, but Lamia couldn't help but gaze forlornly at her sobbing sister. The next day. The first thing Chrysalis noticed when they exited the chambers allotted to them in the keep was Celestia in shining armor waiting for them in the hall. After exchanging very chilly greetings, made only worse by Chrysalis' escorting platoon of chevaliers glaring at shining armor, the group set off to the dungeons. Throughout the journey, there was no conversation, only the stamp of hooves against the floor. A part of Chrysalis had wanted to ask Celestia on where she was keeping Syndra. Her anger at her traitorous daughter was far stronger, though, and so Chrysalis kept her mouth shut. The entrance hall to the holding cells was lined with stark white walls, only interspaced by steel doors. Each door had a shuttered metal window and was interlaced with an absurd amount of holding and reinforcing enchantments. A minotaur would have trouble getting through those doorways. Duly impressed by the security measures of the ponies, Chrysalis turned her attention to Captain Shining Armor and several other guards' ponies, also present. Few of them were on guard duty. The rest were examining and sorting the armor and equipment on the table not far away from the prison cells.
"Captain, anything to report?"
asked Celestia. Shining Armor snapped a quick salute and bowed in a rather apologetic manner to Chrysalis before turning his attention back to the items. "Yes, Your Highness. So far I have concluded several things about the assassins from the equipment they have carried," said Shining Armor, his tone uncharacteristically grim and his brow furrowed. Chrysalis frowned. This was a visage very different from the Shining Armor she had hypnotized during the royal wedding. "First of all, these assassins were likely a small organization, and probably not extraordinarily expansive," said Shining Armor. Celestia and Chrysalis nodded out of no small relief. That was abruptly shattered as the captain's countenance darkened. "Enjoy that, because that's the only good news I have. We're dealing with a small, concentrated, and disciplined cohort of ponies, probably linked to the lower rungs of the military hierarchy. Some of them are definitely military or in the militia." Shining Armor took a deep breath and paused, as if he couldn't stomach the words he was about to say next. "The assassins were part of a trained and coordinated paramilitary organization who has a vendetta against your hive, Queen Chrysalis." No pony or changeling moved, and for a moment there was silence. That was until Chrysalis snarled, her sharp fangs gleaming wickedly in the light. "Let them come, and they will perish one by one," said the Changeling Queen. Every syllable, every word cutting through the air like a keen-edged knife, a growl in her voice.
"Chrysalis, no pony is going to come and kill you or your hive,"
said Celestia, in a tone that brooked no argument. Chrysalis groaned in disappointment. It looked like Celestia was going to step in for her little ponies yet again. She should have known better. Thus, it was a shock to Chrysalis when the cool air in the windowless room suddenly became uncomfortingly warm.
"Because we are going to find out who they are, and we are going to punish them for the foolishness nearly brought about."
Celestia's declaration echoed through the chamber like a tidal wave. Its tone shook the ponies of all present in the room. Ponies and changeling alike. The words slamming into the heart of every chevalier and guard, rocking them to the innermost core. Chrysalis wasn't scared, but she was really surprised at Celestia's unexpected anger. She hid it, though.
"Captain Armor, how have you made your conclusions regarding the paramilitary organization that tried to assassinate Chrysalis?"
demanded Celestia. Shining Armor took a moment to recover from Celestia's declaration before he switched to the professional demeanor representative of his position as captain of the Royal Guard. "We can tell that from the armor and weapons. The armor is a Mark 42 battle and ceremonial armor that came into use 30 years ago, before production was stopped 20 years ago. The Mark 42 was the primary ceremonial and battle armor of our Royal Guards, but is now designated for the Equestrian Militia and Royal Reserves. All the armor sets show signs of previous use. The fact they are using out-of-date armor only available in our reserve units
means that our organization needed to be one link to the lower rungs of the military. That type of administrative power would provide them with the more antiquated armor and explain why they didn't have newer equipment. Shining Armor gestured to the weapons. I drew my conclusions that the assassins were part of a small, organized group due to their weapons. None of these are forged by the Royal Armory that equips our army. Note that the serial and maker's marks were filed away or magically wiped, which indicates of how prepared this group of assassins were. Luckily, it's quite easy to tell that the weapons were forged from private owners. For one, warhammers and axes aren't standard armament for our military units. Also, while all the weapons are of decent quality, they have a dissimilar shape and size. If you look at the steel of the weapons closely, there is a variance in the metal of the weapons and the smithing techniques used to heat the metal. These weapons weren't simply plundered or scavenged either, as they do bear personal markings. Shining Armor quickly levitated one of the bardishes. This battle axe had a self-made hand grip to help the user swing. The unicorn then levitated one of the swords with a bit of a grimace and gestured to a small marks on the iron guard. See the cuts on the hilt? That's the beginning of a kill count. Before Chrysalis could vent her fury, Shining Armor dropped the sword with a scowl of disgust. Which allows me to conclude that the ponies were likely military or part of the militia. While it's not so difficult to gather a small group of ponies who privately own weapons, it's much harder to gather ponies who know how to treat their armor and weapons as well as a military-trained pony. Shining levitated one of the burnished chest plates of the golden armor. This is parade-grade armor polishing that is instilled into every guard and every militia member of the equestrian military. Then tapped a spear's point, not even wincing when his hoof was pricked. And any military pony would be glad to own a spear polished like this. Shining Armor turned to the group. Admittedly, weapon and armor care doesn't mean the ponies are necessarily military. But the assassins made one critical mistake that was necessary for them to carry out their plan. And it firmly places the members of this organization as military or militia members. The unicorn levitated an innocent-looking stack of white paper and gave it to Celestia and Chrysalis.
"What's this?"
asked Chrysalis, confused at the numbers and figures on the sheet. It appeared to be some sort of supply report or receipt. However, Celestia's sudden gasp made Chrysalis spin around, puzzled at why the alicorn seemed so alarmed.
"Captain, you mean they masqueraded our supply party, smuggling in their own weapons and armor as military goods? But the papers of entry and supply receipts were signed by military officers who verified to the identity of these ponies as either militia or army members. What the hell were your guards ponies doing, Captain?"
demanded Celestia, her deafening roar echoing through the room. Your Highness, the reason the convoy of assassins managed to pass as a supply convoy was because they had the proper military identification papers. They were all actual members of the equestrian army and the equestrian militia, said Armor. Silence permeated throughout the room as ponies and changelings alike. That calm was abruptly shattered by the slam of Celestia's hooves onto the ground as she marched up to Shining Armor, her eyes blazing.
"Captain Armor, I thought you were aware of hostile anti-changeling elements within our army. I admit the information was classified when I gave it to you, but that does not excuse this breach in security. Care to explain yourself, Captain?"
snapped Celestia. Every pony in the room stared as the irate princess chastised her captain of the guard. Shining Armor, for the most part, was trying not to flinch, a guilty look on his face. What happened, Princess, was that I failed to cover all the risks to Queen Chrysalis and her entourage. Yes, I had protocols in place to regulate the entry of military personnel, which included a resupply schedule. Military ID checks and regulation are forced outside personnel to leave their main armaments. However, I failed to anticipate the possibility, however unlikely, that weapons or hostile personnel could be smuggled in, and was unable to provide sufficient security coverage within the base area. Shining Armor sighed, but didn't avert his gaze from either Chrysalis or Celestia. I'm sorry, Princess, Queen Chrysalis. It was my failure that allowed this assassination attempt on Queen Chrysalis's life. That's not true, Princess. Eyes and heads turned to see one of the royal guard's ponies backed by several of his companions. Shining Armor glared at them, but the ponies refused to back down. The procedures the captain had stated would have been sufficient to catch the infiltrators if we had followed them all, said the guard, averting his gaze in shame. Several of the assassins were ponies who once served in our units, and when we recognized them and confirmed their identification papers, we waved them in without checking their supplies they were bringing in more stringently, explained another guard. Celestia's eyes softened, but only for a moment before her eyes narrowed. I thank you for having the courage to admit your own mess, but do not assume that your honesty will leave you free from any disciplinary action. The group of guards gulped Celestia's statement, but nodded dutifully. Features grim, Celestia turned back at Shining Armor. To Chrysalis's admiration, the captain didn't even cringe as his sovereign dressed him down in a tone so cold and full of biting disappointment it would make a full-grown minotaur cry. Captain Armor, this debacle wasn't entirely your fault, and you did cover all the common and obvious risks. Celestia then gestured pointedly at Chrysalis, whose right side was still bandaged from yesterday's engagement. But on our watch, your watch, a foreign dignitary supposedly under our protection was attacked and very nearly killed. You should have anticipated every scenario, no matter how unlikely, and at least attempt to address them. Do I have to remind you of the motto of the Canterlot Royal Guard Academy? Constant vigilance, Your Highness, said Shining Armor. His voice clipped. Chrysalis could sense the pony's guilt and shame pouring out like a waterfall, but he maintained his posture. Good. I will not demote you or remove you from this conference, but consider your role as chief of this base security at an end. I will be bringing in a replacement as well as reinforcements to this base in the light of the Royal Guard's failure. Perhaps General Legate Hannibal and her Equestrian Foreign Legion will suffice to keep any similar incidents from ever happening again. Is that understood, Captain Armor? Demanded Celestia. The shock and despair that spread throughout the faces of the Royal Guard's ponies was only matched by Chrysalis's surprise. She supposed Celestia would punish the Royal Guards for allowing the assassins to attack her, but the Queen never anticipated the extent of Celestia's wrath. She had taken deliberate steps to ensure the Royal Guards would be disgraced, and that they would remember it. The Alicorn's actions also served to crush the remainder of Chrysalis's suspicion that Celestia ordered the assassination. Yes, Your Highness, said Shining Armor as smartly as he could. That last part of his voice was choked, as the humiliation overcame his discipline. No pony or changeling but Chrysalis and perhaps Celestia noticed this lapse in stoicism. As much as he screwed up, Princess Celestia, I have to agree with Captain Armor's analysis of the assassins, said Chrysalis, before she could stop herself. Shining Armor gawked at Chrysalis, which was quite unsurprising. Given the nature of the captain's past experience with Chrysalis, his reaction was copied throughout the room by various ponies and changelings alike. I was merely expressing the disciplined nature of the combatants, my chevaliers, and I faced only to confirm the captain's findings, said Chrysalis coolly. Despite her attempts, the end of the queen's mouth twitched in embarrassment. Indeed. Now, Captain Armor, we intend to interrogate some of the prisoners personally. I suggest against that, Your Highness, interrupted Shining Armor. Celestia's eyebrows shot up, as did Chrysalis's. Neither expected the captain to cut off his sovereign. We currently have 8 prisoners in the holding cells that we awakened from your sleeping spell. Despite our attempts to interrogate them, they remained silent. In the rare case, our prisoners just hurled insults at us. I propose we immediately transfer the prisoners to be interrogated by Reigns immediately, said Shining Armor. Reigns? Asked Chrysalis. The acronym seemed familiar, but not in a good way. The Royal Equestrian Intelligence and Naval Service? What has been the nature of their insults? Asked Celestia, forestalling Chrysalis's questioning gaze. Shining Armor glanced at Chrysalis and hesitated for a moment. Mainly it's directed at you and your species, Queen Chrysalis. Revenge for Canterlot seems a rather common one. Chrysalis bit her lip and averted her gaze. The rest of her changeling escort swallowed awkwardly and refused to meet the eyes of the ponies in the room. Is there a leader among the ponies? One who seems more fanatical or perhaps more silent than the others? Asked Celestia, taking advantage of Chrysalis's silence. Shining took a moment to consider Celestia's question. Actually, I think I have isolated the leader of the squad based on his identity, equipment, and character. And if he isn't the leader, he'll be likely a member who holds a key position in the organization. Then let us speak to him, said Celestia. Shining Armor nodded and showed the 2 rulers to one of the cells. Through the shutter in the door, Chrysalis and Celestia saw Pegasus, his hooves chained to a steel chair. He had an overlong mustache, once dashingly curled, now a tattered bush of split ends. A graduate of the Canterlot Officer Training School, Corporal Custard was the former commando of the 7th Cavalry. He nearly got his entire unit slaughtered by provoking a warband of Blackhoof Buffalo and almost caused a war between Equestria and the Buffalo Nations. Celestia growled, surprising Chrysalis with her anger. I remember that incident. We weren't on the most friendly terms with the Buffalo then, especially with the Blackhoof tribe. Custard saw the Buffalo as uncivilized savages and not only insulted them, but ransacked their camp when they refused to comply to his completely unauthorized search demands. Naturally, the Blackhoof tribe were furious and counterattacked, surrounding Custard's ponies. What happened after that? Asked Chrysalis. She had heard of the incident and the result of it, but she was curious to see how the Equestrians had resolved the crisis. If anything, it would give her some insight into how the Equestrian military and Celestia normally addressed cross-species relations. Particularly, what was the most important were Pony's attitudes to other possible hostile groups. Celestia allowed herself a wry smile. At the time, just as a precaution, I had sent my former protege, Hannibal, close to the tribal stamping grounds of the Blackhoof. Wait, General Hannibal was your student? Asked Chrysalis, interrupting Celestia. The Queen wanted to know as much as possible about the pony coming in to replace Shining Armor's position as base commander. Moreover, the Changelings kept profiles of high-ranking and influential equestrians. Hannibal had made it to the collection, and Chrysalis couldn't resist an opportunity to add to that profile. A former student with my blessing. She had reigned and resigned from her studies and joined the military. She managed to trick the buffalo into thinking that half of the equestrian army were on her tail, and got them to accept the terms of the ceasefire, explained Celestia. The Queen arched an eyebrow. Well, that is something I will be certainly adding to our profile of Hannibal, though you probably know that already, said Chrysalis, making no attempt to hide the bitterness in her voice. Celestia winced and opened her mouth. Chrysalis, The Queen raised her perforated hoof, silencing the alicorn. As much as I am at least slightly thankful of your attempt to make amends, let's return to the topic, shall we? Asked Chrysalis. The Queen made no attempt to conceal the edge in her tone, but she wasn't angry. On the contrary, Chrysalis found that Celestia and Shining Armor's story of the events in question corroborated with what her infiltrators had discovered. That and her recent experiences with Celestia were beginning to add to her new perception of the equestrian government, when it came to interspecies relations, at least. In short, Equestria tended to be quite protective of their ponies, but their protectiveness was matched by their willingness to forge peace with other races. Right. Celestia smiled. So, from this incident, we can gather he's probably a racist who is dissatisfied with the army and by the Equestria's handling of the situation. In that case, I suggest I speak first. I might be able to get through to him if I can impress him. On the contrary, Princess, I think I can handle this, said Chrysalis, her lips curling into a wicked grin. But, Chrysalis, before Shining Armor or Celestia could stop the Changeling, Chrysalis had unlocked the door and strode into the room. Wasting no time, Celestia and Shining Armor tried to follow the Changeling Queen in, only to have the door slammed in their faces. Shining Armor gripped the door handle with his magic and pulled with all his might, but to no avail. Several of Chrysalis' escorting Changeling Chevaliers, alarmed that their queen had placed herself in such a dangerous position, joined in Shining in trying to wrestle the door open. But it didn't work. She locked us out. Get the door ram and the... Stand down, all of you! Snapped Celestia, fixing every pony and Changeling with a firm glare. Shining Armor stared at Alternia. But, Your Majesty, Chrysalis will tear him to pieces. The Changeling Chevalier shot a glare at Shining Armor, before turning to Celestia. We do not care for the pony, but we demand to be beside our queen. Shining Armor, Chevaliers, stay calm. If Chrysalis or Custard ever become endangered, I will personally smash into that room. For now, though, activate the scrying enchantments for the cell. I want to see what Queen Chrysalis can get out of the prisoner, said Celestia. The Changeling Chevaliers looked as if they had just been given a feast and quickly stood down. Shining Armor and the guards' ponies gaped at the merciless gleam in Celestia's eyes, but nodded obediently. Before Shining Armor could trot off, though, Celestia leaned forward, placing her mouth next to his ear. I know you don't like this, Shining Armor, but Chrysalis is not our prisoner. She is a sovereign from another nation and has the right to find out why she was attacked. Also, Celestia, no, Alternia, sighed. I want to trust my sister can keep her promises. Shining Armor groaned, but gave Alternia an understanding look at all the same. I follow you, Your Highness. Chrysalis had been prepared for either a violent or terrified reaction of some form from the prisoner. Her guess was confirmed as Custard's eyes widened and his yellow cheeks began to turn purple. At the same time, though, the chains that secured Custard began to clink as the pony trembled in fear. Fear that tasted absolutely delicious to Chrysalis's senses. You! Custard snarled. With a terror he was gripped and strangled the volume of his voice. Thus Custard's statement only served to widen Chrysalis's feigned grin. The Changeling Queen's dagger-like eyes locked onto Custard's panic-filled blue ones. Her wings spread wide, her hooves stomping on the cold stone floor. Chrysalis advanced on the pony. You will address me as Queen Chrysalis, little pony. You will answer every question I have for you, and perhaps I will let you live just a little longer, said Chrysalis in a deadly soft voice. Go to Tartarus, you black she-demon, and take your kind with you, stammered Custard. Chrysalis's eyes narrowed and her fangs glistened in the dim light of the room. In a sudden, swift motion, Chrysalis slammed the table with her hose and thrust her head forward until her nose was almost pressed up against Custard's. The violence of the tactic ripped a loud scream from the Pegasus, and he writhed furiously, trying to get away, but failing. Aw, is the little pony scared of me? Chrysalis extended a leg forward, tenderly running it down Custard's shaking cheek. The pony shook his head, and promptly regretted it as Chrysalis growled, her eyes burning with rage. It was his last warning before the Changeling Queen seized Custard's chair with both hooves and yanked it towards herself. Custard found himself pulled forward until he was unable to see anything but the Changeling's hate-filled green orbs. You better be! Tell me what organization you are a part of! Tell me why they are trying to kill me! Bellowed Chrysalis, right into Custard's face, her snapping jaws mere inches from the Pegasus's muscle. Custard whimpered, his eyes filling with tears, his mane blown back by the strength of the roar. Long live Equestria! Ponies forever, croaked Custard. What did you say? Are you sure of your answer? Asked Chrysalis, silkily, her sneer spreading over her face as she waited silently. She ran her tongue over her fangs, her hoof pressured just a little harder on Custard's Adam's apple. It was too much for Custard. He couldn't take any more of the ordeal he had been subjected to. He promptly broke down in tears. Equestria First, Your Highness. We're part of the Equestria First organization, spluttered Custard. What is Equestria first? Asked Chrysalis, unable to keep the vindictive glee from her voice. We fight the royal guard and the equestrian government. We fight what the equestrian government is afraid to fight. We protect ponies from monsters and aliens, said Custard. Chrysalis's visage darkened at Custard's answer. The pitch of her already menacing tone dropped even lower, into a thunderous rumble. Monsters? And aliens? Like whom? Changelings, buffalo, minotaurs, dragons, zebras, any pony who threatens the existence of a pure pony Equestria, recited Custard. He seemed to draw strength from the words as if they were a prayer, something that Chrysalis was infuriated at. How long have you been doing this? Demanded Chrysalis. For 10 years so far, and our numbers have grown strong in the shadows. We may have failed to rid Equestria of you today, you hell-spawned cretin, but you cannot stop us. We've dealt with queens before, shouted Custard proudly. Silence stilled the cell, as a blank look came over Chrysalis's once furious features. Custard blinked, confused by the Changeling Queen's sudden silence. Several years ago. No, 2.5 years ago, in the middle of autumn, did your organization attack a Changeling Queen and her escort? Asked Chrysalis, quietly. How should I know? Said Custard, with a shrug. His confidence skyrocketing at the frailness of Chrysalis's question. They were carrying a white flag, said Chrysalis, this time with more force, her eyes cold and hard as glacier ice in the midst of midwinter. Custard blinked and his face brightened in recognition. Oh, now I remember. She was a young'un. I didn't lead the attack, but I sure wish I saw the look on that queen's face as we gave her a hoof full of magic. We couldn't recover her corpse, but we sure got her good. Custard gasped, his mouth opening and closing like a desperate goldfish. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't breathe. Green magic was wrapped around his throat. Chrysalis's horn was glowing like an evening star, but despite the bright light emanating from her horn, the features on her face were as dark as a moonless night. Her face was a frozen mask, emotionless, but for the tears of anguish that poured down her cheeks. She was my daughter! Screamed Chrysalis, funneling all her magic to her horn. There was an eardrum-shattering bang, and a blinding flash of golden-green light that made Chrysalis lose her concentration. Blinded, her eyes seeing spots, Chrysalis howled and staggered back. Rapidly, the changeling shook her head, trying to clear her vision. She needed to find that bastard. She needed to make him pay. Out of her tear-blurred eyes, she saw a pony-like figure, and she charged. Except, Chrysalis slammed into a form just as large as her own. It seized her in an iron grip, stopping her from moving, from getting to Custard. Shrieking with anger at being thwarted, Chrysalis flailed wildly at the restraining body. The grip lessened, weakening as Chrysalis repeatedly slammed her hooves into the blurry figure. However, though, Chrysalis felt that she could almost escape. The pony holding her back just managed to keep a hold on her. It was then Chrysalis noticed the sharp pangs of pain stabbing into her side, where she had been hit by some of the assassins. Chrysalis groaned. Her sudden burst of strength had somehow opened up one of her wounds. the pain cleansing the fog of berserk rage that had descended on her mind. Exhausted, Chrysalis collapsed against the figure that held her, sobbing quietly into its shoulder.
Chrysalis, I'm so sorry,
said the white form. Chrysalis blinked, and as the features finally fell into focus, she gasped. The room was trashed. The table had been thrown aside. Custer was surrounded by shining armor's shield spell as well as 3 other guards ponies. All of them were glaring at the chained Pegasus with contempt-filled eyes. Chrysalis saw Chevaliers standing beside her, realizing just now they had been seizing her hind legs. Two would even seize her tail with their teeth. Chrysalis turned her attention forward to find out who had been restraining order, only to be met with a determined magenta gaze, for in front of Chrysalis was Celestia. The alicorn was wincing a bit, and her right eye beginning to bruise. Her crown had been knocked off, and she was panting slightly. However, her hooves were wrapped around Chrysalis's body in a firm grip.
"Get your hooves off me, Celestia!"
snapped Chrysalis.
"Promise me you won't attack Custard if I release you,"
said Celestia, evenly. Chrysalis sighed.
"I won't harm him. At least not with my own hooves."
The queen attempted to fix Celestia with a piercing glare, but she was too exhausted by the day's events.
"I want him and his companions punished, and I want to have a say in how they will pay,"
said Chrysalis.
"Agreed. Custard and his compatriots will answer to Changeling and equestrian justice. No death penalty, but I will allow you as much legal right as possible to choose the punishment they will undergo,"
said Celestia. Chrysalis frowned. There had to be a catch to Celestia's offer. However, when the Changeling Queen met Celestia's eyes, she blinked. The alicorn's magenta eyes burned with unhindered righteous fury. Despite Celestia's composed mask and placid stance, her emotions had flared into an inferno of anger. The intensity did not shock Chrysalis, for she had felt Celestia's anger before. But now, Celestia wasn't angry at Chrysalis. She was angry for her and her daughter. It was a change that caught the queen off guard. Though she could not deny, it was a rather pleasing feeling. The alicorn was siding more with her on this matter.
"That will do,"
said Chrysalis. Celestia grimaced and slowly released Chrysalis. Only then did Chrysalis see the rapidly forming bruises on Celestia's skin. Around Celestia's hind legs, the stone floor was cracked. Chrysalis gawked, surprised at the strength of her charge. She hadn't expected to get so much speed in the confines of the interrogation cell.
"I'm sorry I hurt you. I just lost yourself to anger."
"Don't worry, Chrysalis. We all do that from time to time.
"And you have a good reason to,"
said Celestia, with a wry smile. The alicorn slowly turned to face the trembling Corporal Custard, who was now white as a sheet.
"As for you, I have a question for you, Corporal Custard,"
said Celestia. "Go ahead, Your Highness," whimpered Custard.
"Why?"
asked Celestia. Every pony and changeling in the room was puzzled by the question, Chrysalis in particular. "Why, what, Your Highness?" asked Custard, confused as every pony else.
Why do you see anybody, not a pony, as a monster? Why can't you talk with them to figure out a solution? Why didn't you approach the royal courts? Why must you resort to these violent means?
Because harmony demands of it, Your Highness. We can't let these aliens roam free through our land, spreading discord wherever they go, said Custard. Celestia's already burning eyes shone even brighter as she fixed Custard with a glare that could boil iron. When she spoke, her voice was not too loud, nor was it too soft. But somehow the words echoed throughout the room, spreading through the interrogation cells, each word laced with disappointment that cut like a keen-edged blade into everybody's heart. Harmony demands of it, you say? Let me tell you what you and the rest of your organization has done for harmony, said Celestia. You broke your oaths of loyalty to the equestrian military, which were to protect and serve innocents of all species. You were selfish and never gave the Changeling delegation any generosity. Instead, you selfishly chose to follow your own goals instead of considering the wishes of others. You failed to show kindness to those whose only crime is that they were born different from you. You provoked the invasion of Canterlot. Yes, your attack on Chrysalis's daughter provoked her attack on Canterlot. Thus, your organization inadvertently ended the laughter of so many ponies in a time of celebration. You lied to yourselves, feeding and creating a false dream of a supposedly pony-only Equestria, when for more than 500 years we've been accepting immigrants into our society and have seen no ill effects. Finally, you rejected friendship without considering its magic, and instead abused magic to inflict heinous crimes whose only result was to create an almost irreparable rift between ponies and changelings, ever coexisting. Never mind cooperating. You nearly caused a war. Have our military academies taught you nothing about the destructiveness of what conflict brings? Have you not attended the Hearth's-warming Eve celebrations? Custard's head was shaking in denial, his lips mouthing no with an ever-increasing desperation. Celestia was not finished. Taking a deep breath, the alicorn sighed sadly. You are never getting rid of discord, Corporal Custard. You've been causing it, said Celestia, her words falling with dreadful finality. And with that, Celestia, ears flattened in melancholy, walked silently through the ruined doorframe and out of the interrogation cell. Behind her, Chrysalis stood at the ruined doorway, more puzzled than ever how she felt toward the enigmatic alicorn.